Book 1. The Rise of Adolf Hitler. Chapter 1. Birth of the Third Reich. On the very eve of the birth of the Third Reich, a feverish tension gripped Berlin. The Weimar Republic, it seemed obvious to almost everyone, was about to expire. For more than a year it had been fast crumbling. General Kurt von Schleicher, who, like his immediate predecessor, Franz von Papen, cared little for the Republic and less for its democracy, and who, also like him, had ruled as Chancellor by presidential decree without recourse to Parliament, had come to the end of his rope after 57 days in office. On Saturday, January 28, 1933, he had been abruptly dismissed by the aging President of the Republic, Field Marshal von Hindenburg. Adolf Hitler, leader of the National Socialists, the largest political party in Germany, was demanding for himself the chancellorship of the Democratic Republic he had sworn to destroy. The wildest rumors of what might happen were rife in the capital that fateful winter weekend, and the most alarming of them, as it happened, were not without some foundation. There were reports that Schleicher, in collusion with General Kurt von Hammerstein, the commander-in-chief of the army, was preparing a putsch with the support of the Potsdam garrison for the purpose of arresting the president and establishing a military dictatorship. There was talk of a Nazi putsch. The Berlin stormtroopers, aided by Nazi sympathizers in the police, were to seize the Wilhelmstrasse, where the president's palace and most of the government ministries were located. There was talk also of a general strike. On Sunday, January 29th, 100,000 workers crowded into the Lustgarten in the center of Berlin to demonstrate their opposition to making Hitler chancellor. One of their leaders attempted to get in touch with General von Hammerstein to propose joint action by the army and organized labor, should Hitler be named to head a new government. Once before, at the time of the Kapp putsch in 1920, a general strike had saved the Republic after the government had fled the capital. Throughout most of the night from Sunday to Monday, Hitler paced up and down in his room in the Kaiserhof Hotel on the Reichskanzlerplatz, just down the street from the Chancellery. Despite his nervousness, he was supremely confident that his hour had struck. For nearly a month he had been secretly negotiating with Papen and the other leaders of the conservative right. He had had to compromise. He could not have a purely Nazi government. But he could be chancellor of a coalition government whose members, 8 out of 11 of whom were not Nazis, agreed with him on the abolition of the democratic Weimar regime. Only the aged, dour president had seemed to stand in his way. As recently as January 26th, 2 days before the advent of this crucial weekend, the grisly old field marshal had told General von Hammerstein that he had no intention whatsoever of making that Austrian corporal either Minister of Defense or Chancellor of the Reich. Yet under the influence of his son, Major Oskar von Hindenburg, of Otto von Meissner, the State Secretary to the President, of Papen and other members of the Palace Camarilla, the President was finally weakening. He was 86 and fading into senility. On the afternoon of Sunday, January 29th, while Hitler was having coffee and cakes with Goebbels and other aides, Hermann Göring, president of the Reichstag and second to Hitler in the Nazi Party, burst in and informed them categorically that on the morrow Hitler would be named chancellor. Shortly before noon on Monday, January 30th, 1933, Hitler drove over to the Chancellery for an interview with Hindenburg that was to prove fateful for himself, for Germany, and for the rest of the world. From a window in the Kaiserhof, Goebbels' room and other Nazi chiefs kept an anxious watch on the door of the Chancellery, where the Führer would shortly be coming out. "We would see from his face whether he had succeeded or not," Goebbels noted. For even then they were not quite sure. "Our hearts are torn back and forth between doubt, hope, joy, and discouragement," Goebbels jotted down in his diary. "We have been disappointed too often for us to believe wholeheartedly in the great miracle." A few moments later, they witnessed the miracle. The man with the Charlie Chaplin mustache, who had been a down-and-out tramp in Vienna in his youth, an unknown soldier of World War I, a derelict in Munich in the first grim post-war days, the somewhat comical leader of the beer hall putsch, this spellbinder who was not even German but Austrian, and who was only 43 years old, had just been administered the oath as Chancellor of the German Reich. He drove the 100 yards to the Kaiserhof and was soon with his old cronies, Goebbels, Goering, Röhm, and the other brown shirts who had helped him along the rocky, brawling path to power. "He says nothing, and all of us say nothing," Goebbels recorded, "but his eyes are full of tears." That evening, from dusk until far past midnight, the delirious Nazi stormtroopers marched in a massive torchlight parade to celebrate the victory. By the tens of thousands, they emerged in disciplined columns from the depths of the Tiergarten, passed under the triumphal arch of the Brandenburg Gate and down the Wilhelmstrasse, their bands blaring the old martial airs to the thunderous beating of the drums, their voices bawling the new Horst Wessel song and other tunes that were as old as Germany, their jackboots beating a mighty rhythm on the pavement, their torches held high and forming a ribbon of flame that illuminated the night and kindled the hurrahs of the onlookers massed on the sidewalks. From a window in the palace, Hindenburg looked down upon the marching throng, beating time to the military marches with his cane, apparently pleased that at last he had picked a chancellor who could arouse the people in a traditionally German way. Whether the old man in his dotage had any inkling of what he had unleashed that day is doubtful. A story, probably apocryphal, soon spread over Berlin that in the midst of the parade he had turned to an old general and said, "I didn't know we had taken so many Russian prisoners." A stone's throw down the Wilhelmstrasse, Adolf Hitler stood at an open window of the Chancellery, beside himself with excitement and joy, dancing up and down, jerking his arm up continually in the Nazi salute, smiling and laughing until his eyes were again full of tears. One foreign observer watched the proceedings that evening with different feelings. "The river of fire flowed past the French embassy," André-François Poncet, the ambassador, wrote, "whence, with heavy heart and filled with foreboding, I watched its luminous wake." Tired but happy, Goebbels arrived home that night at 3 a.m. Scribbling in his diary before retiring, he wrote, "It is almost like a dream, a fairy tale. The new Reich has been born. 14 years of work have been crowned with victory. The German Revolution has begun." The Third Reich, which was born on January 30th, 1933, Hitler boasted, would endure for 1,000 years, and in Nazi parlance it was often referred to as the 1,000-Year Reich. It lasted 12 years and 4 months, but in that flicker of time, as history goes, it caused an eruption on this earth more violent and shattering than any previously experienced, raising the German people to heights of power they had not known in more than a millennium, making them at one time the masters of Europe from the Atlantic to the Volga, from the North Cape to the Mediterranean, and then plunging them to the depths of destruction and desolation at the end of a world war which their nation had cold-bloodedly provoked, and during which it instituted a reign of terror over the conquered peoples which, in its calculated butchery of human life and the human spirit, outdid all the savage oppressions of the previous ages. The man who founded the Third Reich, who ruled it ruthlessly and often with uncommon shrewdness, who led it to such dizzy heights and to such a sorry end, was a person of undoubted, if evil, genius. It is true that he found in the German people, as a mysterious providence and centuries of experience had molded them up to that time, a natural instrument which he was able to shape to his own sinister ends. But without Adolf Hitler, who was possessed of a demonic personality, a granite will, uncanny instincts, a cold ruthlessness, a remarkable intellect, a soaring imagination, and, until toward the end, when, drunk with power and success, he overreached himself, an amazing capacity to size up people and situations, there almost certainly would never have been a Third Reich. It is one of the great examples, as Friedrich Meinecke, the eminent German historian, said, of the singular and incalculable power of personality in historical life. To some Germans, and no doubt to most foreigners, it appeared that a charlatan had come to power in Berlin. To the majority of Germans, Hitler had, or would shortly assume, the aura of a truly charismatic leader. They were to follow him blindly, as if he possessed a divine judgment, for the next 12 tempestuous years. The advent of Adolf Hitler. Considering his origins and his early life, it would be difficult to imagine a more unlikely figure to succeed to the mantle of Bismarck, the Hohenzollern emperors, and President Hindenburg than this singular Austrian of peasant stock who was born at 6:30 on the evening of April 20th, 1889, in the Gasthof zum Pommer, a modest inn in the town of Braunau am Inn, across the border from Bavaria. The place of birth on the Austro-German frontier was to prove significant, for early in his life, as a mere youth, Hitler became obsessed with the idea that there should be no border between these two German-speaking peoples, and that they both belonged in the same Reich. So strong and enduring were his feelings that at 35, when he sat in a German prison dictating the book that would become the blueprint for the Third Reich, his very first lines were concerned with the symbolic significance of his birthplace. Mein Kampf begins with these words: "Today it seems to me providential that fate should have chosen Braunau am Inn as my birthplace. For this little town lies on the boundary between two German states which we of the younger generation at least have made it our life work to reunite by every means at our disposal. This little city on the border seems to me the symbol of a great mission." Adolf Hitler was the third son of the third marriage of a minor Austrian customs official who had been born an illegitimate child, and who for the first 39 years of his life bore his mother's name, Schicklgruber. The name Hitler appears in the maternal as well as the paternal line. Both Hitler's grandmother on his mother's side and his grandfather on his father's side were named Hitler, or rather variants of it, for the family name was variously written as Hiedler, Hütler, Hütler with two T's, and Hitler. Adolf's mother was his father's second cousin, and an episcopal dispensation had to be obtained for the marriage. The forebears of the future German Führer on both sides dwelt for generations in the Waldviertel, a district in Lower Austria between the Danube and the borders of Bohemia and Moravia. In my own Vienna days, I sometimes passed through it on my way to Prague or to Germany. It is a hilly, wooded country of peasant villages and small farms, and though only some 50 miles from Vienna, it has a somewhat remote and impoverished air, as if the main currents of Austrian life had passed it by. The inhabitants tend to be dour, like the Czech peasants just to the north of them. Intermarriage is common, as in the case of Hitler's parents, and illegitimacy is frequent. On the mother's side there was a certain stability. For 4 generations, Clara Pulzel's family remained on peasant holding number 37 in the village of Spital. The story of Hitler's paternal ancestors is quite different. The spelling of the family name, as we have seen, changes, the place of residence also. There is a spirit of restlessness among the Hitlers, an urge to move from one village to the next, from one job to another, to avoid firm human ties and to follow a certain bohemian life in relations with women. Johann Georg Hiedler, Adolf's grandfather, was a wandering miller, plying his trade in one village after another in Lower Austria. 5 months after his first marriage, in 1824, a son was born, but the child and the mother did not survive. 18 years later, while working in Dürenthal, he married a 47-year-old peasant woman from the village of Stronus, Maria Anna Schicklgruber. 5 years before the marriage, on June 7, 1837, Maria had had an illegitimate son whom she named Alois, and who became Adolf Hitler's father. It is most probable that the father of Alois was Johann Hiedler, though conclusive evidence is lacking. At any rate, Johann eventually married the woman, but contrary to the usual custom in such cases, he did not trouble himself with legitimizing the son after the marriage. The child grew up as Alois Schicklgruber. Anna died in 1847, whereupon Johann Hiedler vanished for 30 years, only to reappear at the age of 84 in the town of Weitra in the Waldviertel. The spelling of his name now changed to Hitler, to testify before a notary in the presence of 3 witnesses that he was the father of Alois Schicklgruber.